So you've got a funky elbow, but don't worry, your archery career doesn't have to be over just yet. In fact, the last 3 individual women's Olympic gold medalists have also had hypermobility in the bow side elbow. So today, that's what we're breaking down. In this video, I'm going to take you through what is hypermobility. We're going to look at how it affects archery technique, how to incorporate it within your shot process. We're going to look at injury prevention, and also the top 3 coaching mistakes that I see all the time with archers who have hypermobility. And guess what? I'm qualified to talk about this because I've got one too. So hypermobility is where a joint can move beyond what is considered a normal range of motion. Now, it's important here to clarify the difference between hypermobility and hyperextension because the 2 terms are often conflated. You see, hyperextension is where a joint is manipulated beyond its natural range. And this can cause an injury to the joint and the connective tissues and ligaments, leading to quite severe injury. Whereas hypermobility is where the normal or the natural range of the joint is beyond what is considered normal. So if we're talking about the elbow, for example, hypermobility is where the joint can extend beyond 180 degrees. So hypermobility is actually very common, and it can be observed in as many as 20% of people. Now, what's important to understand though, is that the degree of hypermobility can vary significantly from person to person. Now, in most people, it's pretty benign. You may not even notice that they have it, and it's not going to impact them in any way whatsoever. But in severe cases, it can actually cause a pretty significant impediment to their daily functionality. Particularly people who have hypermobility in the knees or the hips or the shoulders can actually cause quite severe postural issues that need to be managed. So whilst hypermobility is common, it tends to be more common in women and also in pre-adolescence. Now, in the case of children, as they mature and go through puberty, often they can grow out of hypermobility as their bone structure develops and they come into full physical maturity. But this is not exclusively the case because, well, I have a hypermobile elbow joint, and you may have noticed that I'm not a pre-adolescent female. So whilst it is more common in women and children, it is certainly not exclusively the case. So the final point that I want to make about hypermobility is that hypermobility and the range of motion for any joint is limited by the structure of the joint itself. And this means that hypermobility cannot be fixed through strength training.
So I wanted to find some examples of athletes from other sports that have hypermobility, and it didn't take me long. Look, here's an athlete on the rings here, quite severe hypermobility. This is an Olympic weightlifter. I believe she is a European champion, so she's definitely no slouch. And again, you can see quite severe hypermobility in the elbow joints. And another athlete on the rings. And so, look, these guys have immense upper body strength. And so you're not going to really convince me or anyone else for that matter that these guys need more strength training in order to address their hypermobility issues. It's just simply not the case.
Now, we discussed before about cases where people have hypermobility through the hips or shoulders, and this can be a severe impediment to their daily functionality and an increased risk of injury for them. And so in these cases, strength training can be very important to provide stability around the joint. The difference to understand though is that shoulders and hips are very articulate joints. They move through lots of planes of motion. Whereas when we discuss the elbow, we only have a single plane of motion. And so very little can be done to address this hypermobility. And it's more about how you accommodate it within your shot process. Now, the primary way in which hypermobility affects archery technique is in the flexion of the bow side elbow, reducing string clearance. Now, let me demonstrate. Under the compressive force of a recurve bow, the joint will extend in hypermobile cases towards the string, reducing string clearance and causing painful contact with the inside of the arm. Now, it's very important, and I feel like as coaches, we have an obligation to address this in as soon as the first archery lesson. Because if you can't address it in the first archery lesson, it doesn't matter what else you can do. Because if a student is continually striking their arm consistently on the inside of the arm, it can be very painful. They're certainly not going to have any success hitting the target. And if we can't address this, they're not going to come back, and you're going to immediately pretty much reduce your talent pool by as much as 10%. So the primary way in which we can help archers with hypermobility avoid string clearance issues with the bow arm is through an extra degree of internal humeral rotation. Now I'm going to demonstrate 3 positions for you, and what I've done is I've attached an arrow to my elbow so that you can see the angle of internal humeral rotation on my bow arm. Okay, watch closely. So the first case scenario that I want to demonstrate to you is with the elbow in a neutral position without any internal rotation. And you can see in this case, this is pretty much the worst case scenario for someone who has hypermobility on the bow side elbow. Under full extension, the bow side elbow will flex towards the string, reducing string clearance, and they're pretty much going to get strong contact on the bow arm on the inside of the elbow every single time. Now, the second position that I want to demonstrate is with what is considered a normal degree of internal rotation, where the elbow is pretty much pointing straight up and down. So in this case, in most cases for normal people, this is quite sufficient. However, with hypermobility under full extension of the bow side elbow, you can see that the arm is still flexing towards the string. And in many cases, especially under the compressive force of a recurve bow, this will still not be sufficient in order to achieve string clearance. So the third and often the preferential position for archers with hypermobility is to add an extra degree of internal humeral rotation. So from the neutral position, if we rotate further than what is considered normal, you can see that I can increase the clearance on the bow arm and avoid those strong string contact issues. Now, the best way to first learn how to correctly do this degree of internal rotation, whether you have hypermobility or not, is to simply practice against a post or a wall where you can do it without the complexity of the bow and the arrows and the target and all that sort of stuff. So what we want to do is first find yourself a nice handy post. Here's one I prepared earlier. And start with your arm at about the right height, like so. We want to first set the shoulder down. The intention here is not to rotate the shoulder in. In fact, the intention is to not do that. What we're trying to do is to learn how to keep the shoulder set correctly and internally rotate the bow arm simply from the humerus. So it's internal humeral rotation, not rotation of the shoulder girdle like so. So set your bow arm against the post, okay? Set the shoulder down first. Internally rotate the bow arm to the maximal degree that you can, but never compromise on rotating the shoulder in. Now, this may in fact require some hands-on assistance from a coach or a training partner who can help you to find that correct position. What you will find if you've never trained this before is that as you internally rotate, you'll find some muscles twitching and firing up because it's quite a counterintuitive position. But with a little bit of practice against a post or a wall, you can get good at this position. The second thing to practice is once you can find the correct position, shoulder set, arm internally rotated, is to lean into the post, apply force, just like the bow will be applying force into your bow arm. Because what we need to learn in order to maintain this throughout the shot process is maintain the shoulder set position and the front arm rotated throughout the entire shot process. If you fail to maintain this under compressive force, then if you don't push back, then when the bow pushes you, the arm's going to pop up and you're going to have those string contact issues. And so my recommendation is that when you're first learning, you set the position, internally rotate the arm, apply pressure into the post or the wall, and hold that position for 20 seconds before shaking it off, relaxing for 20 seconds, and repeat. The more you do it, the better you get, the easier it is. So one thing that should be rather obvious by now is that archers who have hypermobility, by definition, have a larger degree of range of motion than what is considered normal. So that means that they may have an optimal position for their internal rotation, which is different to what is considered normal. Okay, please keep this in mind, because what we are not trying to do here is we are not trying to stamp out archers through some cookie cutter coaching approach, which all look exactly identical. because we're all unique individuals with different physiology. And when you have someone with hypermobility, we need to accommodate that within their shot process and within their technique structure. And so the degree or the optimal degree of internal rotation can and does vary significantly from archer to archer. And it depends not only on the degree of mobility or hypermobility of the elbow, but also the degree of internal rotation through the glenohumeral joint, which can vary from person to person. Now, we cover this in detail in the Technique Fundamentals course over at the Rogue Archery Masterclass. So if you're interested in learning more, please go visit the link. I'll leave it down below this video. But through experience, my experience is that archers who have hypermobility of the elbow joint have also a large degree of internal humeral mobility through the shoulder as well. There's a correlation in hypermobility of the elbow and of the shoulder. So what this means is that archers who do have hypermobility can in almost all cases achieve that extra degree of internal rotation required in order to address their string clearance issues.
So there are plenty of examples of elite archers who have a high degree of internal rotation. Here we have Kibo Bay, who is of course the Olympic champion from 2012. We also have Katuna Lorig, 5-time Olympian and fantastic archer and coach in her own right, who has quite a high degree of internal rotation at almost 25 degrees. Jung Yong Ho is the case that I could find who had probably the highest degree of internal rotation, and he has almost 50 degrees of internal rotation on the front arm. And he, of course, was a multiple-time Olympic gold medalist in 2000 and 2004 in the men's Korean team, as well as he set the 90-meter world record. So he's definitely no slouch. And of course, our Olympic champion from 2016, Chung Hae-jin, also has a high degree of internal rotation at over 20 degrees. So there are plenty of examples of archers shooting very successfully with that high degree of internal rotation on the bow arm.
So there's only one other scenario that I wanted to introduce you to, and that is the very rare scenario where an archer has hypermobility of the elbow. However, they do not have the level of internal humeral rotation required to be able to achieve string clearance on the bow arm. Now, like I said before, this is very, very rare, and in almost all cases, almost without exception, we can achieve string clearance through finding the optimal degree of internal rotation. However, I have observed some successful archers who have shot without that high degree of internal rotation. And there's one way of doing it, but it's not pretty. So the only other way to increase string clearance without internally rotating the arm is to compromise on your shoulder alignment. I told you it wasn't pretty. And you'll often see beginners inadvertently shooting in this way because they haven't trained the proper way in which to achieve that string clearance, as we discussed. Now, in the cases where I've observed this working, generally the scenario is where the archer only has a slight degree of hypermobility in the elbow, to the point where they can achieve string clearance by compromising on their shoulder alignment, but only just slightly. And so I don't think this is something that we should aspire to train or to teach people. However, I did want to point it out in this video just for the sake of comprehensively covering this topic. So now that you understand how we can improve our string clearance on the bow arm and how we can accommodate hypermobility within the shot process and within your technique structure, we need to discuss something very important. We need to discuss injury prevention. Now, because I'm advocating for an extra degree of internal rotation in cases with hypermobility, we need to understand and accommodate one more thing to prevent an injury. Now, the injury that I'm talking about is a strain of a muscle called the supraspinatus. Now, the supraspinatus is a muscle that's part of the rotator cuff, and it is an external rotator. It does this motion of externally rotating the arm. Now, the thing that I want to point out here is that as we internally rotate the arm to a higher degree, the supraspinatus, which comes across the shoulder on this angle, is fully stretched, right? This is actually a stretch for the supraspinatus. And in the fully stretched position, the muscle is in its weakest position. This is important to understand because throughout the shot process and in a high repetition, high strain sport like archery, we can cause an overuse injury if we don't accommodate this correctly. But the good news is there's really two key things we can do in order to alleviate the risk of injury with the supraspinatus throughout the shot process. The first thing that we can do is the point at which we rotate the arm throughout the draw sequence. Now, what's very tempting to do is to rotate the arm from the setup position or the set position down here, and then maintain it as you raise and draw the bow. This is not recommended, especially when you have a higher degree of internal rotation. The reason being is when you rotate the arm, again, the more you rotate it, the more the supraspinatus is under strain. And so then when you raise the bow, you're actually overloading the supraspinatus. What we should do instead is actually keep the arm in the neutral position, and as we raise to the apex of the draw, then you should rotate the arm as you come into the pre-draw position. And by pre-draw position, that is the point where you should have the arm fully internally rotated and the front arm set, as I've covered in my other videos. The second thing that we need to do in order to prevent an overuse injury of the supraspinatus is in the follow-through. Now, the intention of the follow-through on the front side shoulder, of course, is to maintain the set position of the shoulder. However, when you have a high degree of internal rotation under the full draw weight of the bow is actually, through compressive force, actually creating lift on this front shoulder. The supraspinatus is not really under a lot of strain. However, when you release the string and the bow drops into the finger sling, the full weight of the bow is going to drop onto this front arm. And if you maintain the arm in a highly rotated position, fully internally rotated, again, this is going to strain the supraspinatus, going to fatigue it, and potentially cause an overuse injury. So what you will generally observe in cases where people do have hypermobility and accommodate this through internal rotation is that you'll notice in the follow-through position, when they release, they will maintain the arm rotated until the point where the bow drops into the finger sling, where they will allow the arm to uncoil in this direction. And what this does, guys, is it allows you to alleviate the strain on the supraspinatus by allowing the arm to become neutral as the bow drops into the finger sling. Now, importantly though, we should never lose the shoulder position. The shoulder shouldn't come up. The bow arm can still maintain up without dropping down like this, but we're just allowing that high degree of internal rotation to relax on the follow through like so. And this is more important for the higher degree of internal rotation required for archers with lots of hypermobility. So now I want to cover something juicy, and I want to cover the top 3 coaching mistakes that we see for archers with a hypermobile elbow joint. Now, I personally know the frustration that is felt for archers that have hypermobility when they rock up to the shooting line, coaches see something that looks a bit different, and then they want to pounce and change things and tell them what to do without fully comprehending the issue. It's actually the reason why I wanted to create this video, to help those archers and also to help inform the coaches and share knowledge to the point where we can help all archers to progress to the maximum and fulfill their full potential. Now, the first coaching mistake that we see on the shooting line, and the most frustrating one, is to tell them, don't do that. You know, the coach will walk up and say, hey, why are you bending your arm that way? Hold it straight. Or they'll say, don't extend your arm that way. As you should already know at this point in the video, that's not possible. Under the compressive force of a recurve bow, the joint must be fully extended. It's not really possible to hold it bent and have any consistency under the load of a recurve bow. A compound bow is different. The draw weight at full draw is much less. And so I can personally tell you how frustrating it is because the archer can simply not do it. Now, the second coaching mistake that we see all the time on the shooting line is to tell the archer that the hypermobility can be fixed through strength training and they need to do more bicep curls.
1002.
Doesn't work that way. As we discussed earlier in this video, the range of motion has to do with the anatomical structure of the joint. If you're suggesting that you can do so many bicep curls that the muscles are tight enough to limit that range of motion, is absolutely ridiculous. That's not how it works. And the third and final coaching mistake that we see all the time is a little bit tragic, and that's just giving up too early. In this video, we've covered how to introduce archers to this technique. However, what we often see is that it takes a little bit of practice. It takes a little bit of training. And if archers can't immediately get it on a proper bow, in fact, they're unlikely to, you need to pull them aside, get them against the post, get them to have success on the simplest possible version before progressing them up. We often use these training bows because they're very light and it can allow for minor corrections in technique, as well as coaching interventions. And so if an archer cannot immediately get this technique, that's okay. Take some time with them, explain to them what they're trying to achieve, break it down to the simplest possible level where they can see success. Because if they see progress and they understand what they're going to do, they'll continue to work on it and they will master it very, very quickly. So there's a joke about nutritionists, that if you take 300 nutritionists and put them in a room together and say, look, you can only leave when you agree on something, what's going to happen? Well, I'll tell you what will happen. They'll argue about the food pyramid. They'll argue about ketogenic diets. They'll argue about gluten intolerances. They'll argue about macro and micronutrients. There'll be vegans in the room. They'll argue about this and that. And eventually, after many hours of debate and deliberation, they will agree that we should all eat more vegetables. So I've got a question for you. What would happen if you took 300 archery coaches and locked them in that same room? Same conditions. You can only leave when you agree on something. Well, I've been in a room like that before, and maybe you have as well. And, you know, we would argue about the KSL shot cycle versus conventional technique and linear draw versus angular draw. We would argue about whether a square stance or an open stance is better. We would argue about how deep your bottom finger should hook the string. We would argue about equipment. We would argue about head position. We would argue about pretty much everything. And eventually we would agree that we should all eat more vegetables. Because if you ask 5 archery coaches, you tend to get 7 opinions. There's actually a pretty good reason for this, because no matter what coaching doctrine you follow, we can look at the top 20 archers in the world from any international event, a World Cup or something, and you can find exceptions to pretty much every one of those rules, right? So here's what no one is doing. No one is looking at those elite archers. No one is looking at, instead of debating the nuances of what they're all doing differently, what are they doing the same? Right? Those are the fundamental principles which allow you to be accurate, consistent, and strong regardless of your shooting style. Those are the technique fundamentals, and that's what we should be focusing on. And this is really the difference between a conventional coaching approach, which I think is old school, and a progressive archery coaching approach. So a conventional archery coaching approach will be, okay, you take 1,000 archers, you teach them all the same thing, and look, no doubt you'll end up with some great archers out of that bunch. If you take 1,000 archers, you might end up with 500 who are fantastic. I'm worried about the other 500, okay? How can we help each individual reach their maximum potential? And what you do, when you understand technique fundamentals, what you can do is something magical happens. You look at archers through a different lens. Instead of trying to fit the archer to the style, you can fit the style to the archer. And you can identify, right, well, for this particular archer, are they going to shoot with a square stance or an open stance? And if it's open, how do you determine what angle it should be open with? Okay, so guys, if that's something you want to be part of, first of all, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and please join me in the Rogue Archery Masterclass. It's my legacy program that I've created to basically equip you with those tools. I believe that building an archer is a lot like if you're building a house. You know, you have to have the right tool for the right job. You wouldn't try and drive a nail with a paintbrush, right? You need a hammer. You wouldn't try and paint a wall with a screwdriver. We'd all laugh at you. So you need the right tool for the job, And I've worked with many coaches over the years and learned a lot of amazing coaches. I've learned so much from all of them. And there's a lot of validity to different shooting styles in different situations. And being able to take this tool for this job and being equipped to be able to use those tools on different archers in different situations is really what I believe is the progressive coaching approach in being able to help each individual archer reach their maximum potential. So in this video, we've talked about hypermobile elbow joints, and the optimal degree of internal rotation is going to be different for everyone, okay? This requires a completely different philosophy than thinking about, oh, what's the optimal way, and then everyone should try and fit that style. It's not the way to think, guys. You know, you need to look at the individual and know how to suit the archer or the style to the archer. So I've got a question for you. What should all coaches agree on? Leave me a comment below this video. Have a think about it, right? Because like I said before, there are exceptions to a lot of rules, but what is a fundamental principle that we should all agree on? Let me know in the comments below this video. Also, let me know what you've learned from this. If you are an archer with hypermobility and you struggle with what we've covered in this video or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me individually. You know, us hypermobile archers, we've got to stick together, right? And if I can help you, I will certainly do my best. And similarly, if you're a coach and you want a second opinion or you need some assistance, then I will try to my best of my ability to be able to help you out. So please don't be shy. Feel free to get in touch. I love it when you guys leave comments below the video and get in touch with me through Facebook or Instagram or through the YouTube channel itself. And yeah, thank you so much for your support as always. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace.